Look at the stories making the headlines here and around the world with the ITV News.
The unimaginable brutality in Bucha, Ukraine. Traumatized residents tell us about mass graves and the execution of innocent civilians by Russian troops who've now been driven out.
Now they've gone, we're beginning to get a fuller picture of the terrible toll inflicted on the civilian population here.
Meanwhile, airstrikes hit critical infrastructure in Ukraine's Black Sea port of Odessa.
More than a month into this war, it remains beyond the reach of Russian soldiers, but well within the range of Russia's missiles.
Here, evidence of a row within the government about how we'll meet our future energy needs. And
they have what they came for. It's the World Cup title.
England's women inspire despite being outclassed by Australia in cricket's World Cup.
This is ITV News with Lucy Watson.
Good evening. The town of Bucha is destined to become synonymous with some of the worst atrocities so far uncovered in Ukraine. After the Russian withdrawal, the bodies of dozens of civilians have been found on the streets and in mass graves, some with signs of torture. The revelations have sparked international outrage. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss called them appalling acts which must be investigated as war crimes. Within the last hour, Russia has responded to the accusations by claiming not a single resident of Bucha was harmed and that pictures of atrocities are faked. But our correspondent Dan Rivers was there in person today and saw the evidence for himself. Here's his report, which contains some very distressing scenes.
At the gateway to Bucha and Hostomel, there are the mangled remains of Russian vehicles and the blown bridge which marks the extent of their advance. And nearby, the burnt bodies of soldiers killed here by a Ukrainian counter-offensive. Gruesome sentinels to a battlefield in which dated Russian machinery was pitted against the latest Western-supplied anti-tank weapons. And this was the result, a rewriting of the orthodoxy about Russia's perceived military strength. Some of the Russians who sought to occupy this commuter town near Kyiv will probably never leave. Thanks to one man's war, the remains may never be repatriated or possibly even identified. This is the most potent symbol of the Russian defeat here in Bucha, a street choked with the charred remains of their tanks and armoured vehicles. Now they've gone, we're beginning to get a fuller picture of the terrible toll inflicted on the civilian population here. War, in all its grotesque brutality, has turned these streets into a hell from which there is no triumph. Massacres of Ukrainian men have been uncovered by the army here. The war crimes committed here mark a bleak new low in this conflict, described by Ukraine as the most outrageous atrocity of the 21st century. This man in neighbouring Hostomel tells me about the rape and murder of a young woman at the hands of two Chechen soldiers, who he and another local man later killed in revenge. For the civilians like Maxim Skripnik caught between the two sides, there was little to do but pray for deliverance.
The main terrible feelings was in the hearts and minds of private people, I mean the civilian people.
Some of the dead were buried by their neighbours close to the shattered remains of their homes. This is where Ina lies, hit by a shell, her grave adorned with food and drink her relatives would have traditionally shared at her funeral. But her son has been unable to reach the town to grieve for his mother. But many more were hastily interred without headstones or even identification. Here, it's believed 280 people were buried in mass graves, one row for Ukrainians, one for Russians.
This is horrible. We survived this. They were shelling us. I cannot find words to describe what we lived through.
This family appear to have escaped unscathed after days in a bunker. until you know Dima's father was detained by the Russians and never seen again. As he swings, he says, if the bad men come back, I'll stamp on them. Dan Rivers, ITV.
And Dan is back in Kiev now. Dan, it must have been a truly harrowing day there in Bucha. The brutality that you have been told about verges on the unspeakable almost.
Yeah, and there's been a chorus of condemnation from Western countries today, from France, the US, UK, and most strongly from Ukraine itself. Tonight, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, talked about Russia's despicable attacks against innocent civilians and accused them of committing war crimes. He said no denial or disinformation from the Kremlin can hide what we all know to be the truth. Putin is desperate, his invasion is failing, and Ukraine's resolve has never been stronger. Russia has responded, suggesting that these scenes are in some ways faked. They've talked about them being the latest provocation by Ukraine. But from what we've seen on the ground, there's no doubt that there were executions, there were rapes in these areas, that there was a reign of terror and death in the places that Russia occupied.
Dan in Kyiv, thank you. Well, while Russian forces abandon the north of Ukraine, their attacks in the south are continuing and spreading. The port of Odessa was hit by Russian airstrikes for the first time this morning. The explosions jolting the city awake, including our correspondent there, John Ray.
Any lingering illusion that the people of Odessa might escape this war unscathed have been shattered. First light broken by half a dozen explosions, and then columns of thick, choking smoke, an ominous signal of a new front on the Black Sea coast. Russia said the target was an oil refinery and storage depot. There were secondary explosions as fuel tanks ignited. All this not far from a residential area in the city's suburbs.
The explosion was so loud and so powerful that it blew the roof off my friend's house.
It looked like a one-sided fight against the flames. What burns here is literally the fuel of Ukraine's resistance. Odessa is Ukraine's main maritime link to the outside world. It is central to the defense of this country. More than a month into this war, it remains beyond the reach of Russian soldiers, but well within the range of Russia's missiles. Some fear Odessa is next in line for sustained attack. Ukraine demands from the West advanced defense systems. Every bomb that falls on our cities is a black mark against the nations that decide to withhold help, said President Zelensky. To the east, Russian TV showed its soldiers fighting for what remains of Mariupol, though these censored and sanitized images barely hint at the suffering of the thousands still trapped in the ruined city. Its destruction leaves Odessa as Ukraine's last big outlet to the sea. There are dark days ahead on the Black Sea coast. John Ray, ITV News, Odessa.
Well, here, the government has ruled out the idea of rationing oil and gas in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and soaring energy prices. Instead, the UK's long-term energy strategy is likely to focus on increasing nuclear and wind power. Those are the two options ministers have been championing this weekend. But there appears to be disagreement in the cabinet about some important details. Catherine Sampson reports.
From being careful with how many cups of tea she makes to turning off heating and using blankets to try and keep out the cold. This wasn't the retirement Patricia Middleton pictured, personally rationing how much energy she uses as bills go up and up.
Everyone should have heating, light and food in this day and age. I don't think it should become how it is, and it's a worry to think what is going to happen and how you will cope.
As the UK tries to rely more on homegrown energy, the government's ruled out rationing. Instead, the Prime Minister looks set to push for more offshore wind and scale up nuclear power. His business secretary is looking at ways to make it easier to build more turbines on land too. But this morning, one of his cabinet colleagues called them
something of an eyesore. The way to go with this is largely, not entirely, but largely off-sea.
The cabinet seem to be saying different things on different days. The Prime Minister seems to say different things on different days. And they've got to make their minds up. They promised us this strategy weeks ago, months ago.
But there's another big problem too. Any large infrastructure projects can take a long time to materialise. It can take up to 17 years to get electricity from a new nuclear plant. What could the government be doing to help in the short term?
We have to look at it in the round and realise that this isn't going to be solved by energy strategy. This is an issue really for welfare strategy.
In the meantime, pensioners like Patricia are left counting the costs.
The future looks a bit bleak, but then I'm a person that never gives up, so I will do whatever I can to survive.
The government says it's doing as much as it can to help. Catherine Sampson, ITV News.
Hundreds of protesters who want the UK to stop using any fossil fuels for energy have been blocking oil and gas depots across the country this weekend. More than 200 people have been arrested. The demonstrations were organised by a group called Just Stop Oil. It wants the UK to ban all new oil, gas and coal projects immediately. There have been arrests in Warwickshire, Essex, Surrey, Hampshire and Birmingham. Somerton and Frome MP David Warburton has been admitted to a psychiatric hospital, suffering from shock and stress, according to his wife. Mr Warburton was suspended from the Conservative Party yesterday after he was accused of serious misconduct. Parliamentary officials are investigating. And police in California are searching for at least one suspect after a mass shooting in Sacramento. 6 people were killed and 10 others injured last night on a busy street packed with bars and restaurants. Sport now, and there was no fairy tale ending for England's cricketers in New Zealand. Just like every holder of the Women's World Cup before them, they too were unable to successfully defend their title. Australia were the better side, but England showed real resilience, just reaching the final after a dreadful start to the tournament. Amy Lewis reports.
For the 7th time, Australia to lift the World Cup trophy.
They have shattered not just England's hearts, but also plenty of records along the way. After a terrible start to this tournament, England turned it around to remarkably reach the final, only to be defeated and devastated. Australia, the favourites, were batting first and didn't falter.
Back-to-back hundreds.
The star of the show was Elisa Healy, who reached 170 off 138 balls.
After one of their great innings.
Australia finished 356 for 5, a record World Cup score. In reply, England lost wickets too early and too regularly.
The skipper departs.
Their biggest hope was Nat Siver, who reached 148.
Creates a little bit of history of her own.
But they were outplayed and outclassed and beaten by 71 runs.
The 5-year master plan has come to fruition for Australia.
I think in terms of things we need to do differently, I think it will take a little bit of time to digest what went wrong, and I think also it's fair to say credit to Australia. They've outplayed us tonight. They've brought their best game.
Right, hit it. Back home, England's success in reaching the final could lead to a surge in women and girls taking up the sport. When the national team do well, do you see more people at a grassroots level wanting to play?
Oh, absolutely. You know, we know since 2017 there has been a real increase in women and girls cricket around the country, which is wonderful. There are now a third more clubs. We've moved from around 2,000 clubs to 2,700 clubs around the country that cater for women and girls.
Australia have now lifted this trophy a record 7 times. England, who failed to retain the title, had to settle with being runners-up. Amy Lewis, ITV News.
To football, and Celtic have taken a major step forward towards regaining the Scottish Premiership title from Rangers. Celtic came from a goal down to beat their old firm rivals 2-1 at Ibrox. Cameron Carter-Vickers scored the winning goal, which leaves Celtic 6 points clear at the top of the table. In the Premier League, West Ham boosted their European hopes for next season, beating Everton 2-1. Jared Bowen scored the winning goal at the London Stadium, a result that leaves the Hammers in 6th place. And it was a good day too for... And there was a record-breaking performance in the boat race today on its return to London after 2 years away because of the pandemic. The Cambridge women's crew set a new record time in their race against Oxford, with the Light Blues extending their consecutive wins to 5. But there was revenge for Oxford in the men's race. In the 167th meeting of the old rivals, the Dark Blues ended their losing streak with victory for the first time since 2017. That's all from us. I'm back for now. I'm back later with the late news at 10 o'clock. Bye-bye.
Visibility may be low this evening as the cold weather hits. Heinz Soups sponsors ITV National Weather.
Hello there, very good evening to you. I hope you've had a lovely weekend. It certainly has been very cold indeed, despite all the sunshine. Last night, some parts recorded their coldest night of the season so far, -8 degrees across parts of Wales and Oxfordshire. Not so tonight. It's all changed because we've got systems moving in across the UK, spreading in thickening cloud and also a fair amount of wind and rain as well. But from a temperature point of view, some areas seeing temperatures 15 degrees warmer than it was last night. But of course, all the cloud and rain, whilst it might be boosting the temperatures, it is going to be giving us a rather grotty start to a brand new week. Of course, many on Easter holidays now. Things do improve across the central and southeastern parts of England, I think, during the second half of the day. It becomes drier and a little bit brighter, but we are generally looking at a fairly cloudy story for everyone tomorrow, with rain coming and going across those western and northwestern parts. It's quite windy as well, but definitely milder than it has been. See you later.
Heinz Soups sponsors ITV National Weather.
Are you ready for some romance?
Yes! Bring it on.
Then take the plunge. All the feels.
Oh.
And all the funnies.
It's like a unicorn.
I could dive right in. Beautiful.
There's so much to fall in love with.
It's like I've died and gone to heaven.
All in one place.
Whose ex is it? To get in on all the action.
Perfect! Go straight to great